Before we move on to the poster session and other activities this evening. And so our next speaker is Josh Young, who joined the Unidata Program Center in March of 2014 as the Community Services Manager. His focus is on collaboration across the Unidata community, and he has a Master of Science in Environmental Science with a focus on the application of scientific data to decision making. Today he's going to talk to us about the Data Management Resource Center to help us all in doing our work into the future, because it's going to be a large part of NSF grants going forward. So, Josh.
Okay, so quick disclaimer for those folks I didn't happen to get to talk to during the brief break. We have a hard deadline of 5:15. The projector gets turned off then. So I apologize for cutting your break short. To continue the disclaimers, I am definitely the least technical presenter of the day and probably the least technical person in the room. No software, no coding was harmed in the making of this presentation. Last disclaimer, not only am I not technical, I actually didn't produce what I'm talking about. That credit goes to Doug Dirtz. This is a little different though in that it's a resource center, right? So it's a guide to things that already exist. It's intended to help folks learn how to use things. So in some ways it made sense for me to present this, because if it's intuitive enough for me to understand it, odds are you could point a master's student or an undergrad student and they would be able to understand how they could use some of these things. So what is the Data Management Resource Center? Well, first off, I have to establish it's not a data management plan. We don't need one of those. There's plenty of great resources in that area. What we did hear from committee members, the community in general, is there's a need for help with implementation. So the DMRC is just that. It's a guide to some freely available open source tools that you can use when you're implementing data management plan. It'll help point you at different things. Part of my job here is not being the expert, right? Like recognizing when other folks are an expert and they don't know what they know. I'm often reminded of like a high school physics teacher I had who was functionally a genius at physics, which meant he was a horrible teacher because he taught everything like we were all experts and we somehow missed this chapter from chapter 1. So what I'm trying to do with this is kind of provide an overview of what you need to do with the data management plan and implementation. So the DMRC highlights requirements from funding agencies, points to best practices that were produced elsewhere. There's a lot of folks working in that domain. This particular resource points to things that were developed by Data One. And then it sorts available tools by best practice and details available tools. So some of the requirements, they're all highlighted from NASA, NOAA, NSF. This PowerPoint is on the Ramada, so if you want any of these things, you can just go through, click on the links. You can also navigate through the Unidata website to get there. And then another disclaimer. Obviously, the agencies are always the authority on their requirements. We try to keep it up to date because it matters to us as well. But just a caveat there. So this is what the best practices table looks like. Oh, there we go. So this stuff here all comes from Data One, and then we map it to available tools that can play in those areas. Now, you may note, well, those are all Unidata tools. Well, this is version like 0.9. So we started with what we knew. We want to add stuff. That's part of why I'm here. You know, we want to know what you're using. So one of my lessons is always provide things in multiple formats or multiple perspectives. We have a table if you like a table. If you prefer a diagram, though, you can just interact with each of these, and it'll point to the various tools that are applicable. So you get to that last one and you say, well, I want to share data, and it points to 3 different things. How do I know which one to use, right? Like my kind of analogy is you come to us and tell us you want to dig a hole. Well, we need to know more than that. Do you want to dig something with a shovel, or do you want to dig with a backhoe, right? Because these things kind of vary on that scale. So the DMRC then kind of provides you with a little intro to each of these things. Now, all of these tools have much more extensive documentation. But if you're a new user, it's kind of daunting to delve into 30 some odd pages of documentation. This lets you know, is it kind of within scope of your project? It identifies the requirements and describes how it could fit. So that's the example for the LDM. This is the Threads data server. A lot of capabilities, but it's more of a backhoe, as it were. If you've got a big project, it might be perfect for you. If you're a smaller project, Ramada might be a better fit. And so this is to help you just identify what you need. As I mentioned, we are exploring adding other tools. That's our intent. Anything that's kind of freely available, open source, we're interested in. So one of those tools is a thing called Dataverse by Harvard. One of our committee members recently kind of suggested we take a look into this. We're still kind of exploring it. Here's the kind of general verbiage they use to describe it. It allows you to create a DOI. It allows you to store, make data accessible in perpetuity. I had to practice saying perpetuity because it's so rare you get to use it when you're talking about data. So we haven't added Dataverse into our tables and whatnot yet because we're still kind of exploring it. We're at the point we've explored it internally. We want to work with some folks in the community to see if your experience working with it is similar to ours before we add it. But here's some of the known characteristics we found so far. So any single file has to be limited to 10 gigabytes. There's no limit to the number of files you can create. You just create your own Dataverse. You designate whether it's private or public. It's open to data from any domain. We know it doesn't corrupt at least some software files. IDV bundles you can save there, download. It's not corrupted. Most importantly, it's free. That's really attractive. So how it could fit into those categories, right? Like, well, it provides DOIs for free. So that's an easy free tool to mint DOIs for your publication requirements. Again, sharing, access for perpetuity, preservation, similar thing. And then lastly, one of the goals of DMRC is to help projects that might otherwise end up being long-tail projects, make it easier on them. This is a very easy way with no cost to make data available that would otherwise be dark. We haven't yet found a way to make data that's stored in a Dataverse machine readable, but if nothing else, if a human can go there and download the data, that's better than it being restricted to some drive under someone's desk. So once we kind of test that, that'll be our first kind of outside of Unidata product. We'd like to include it in these tables. We'd like to include it in the diagrams. But the real reason I'm here is to ask you to continue to submit these kind of tools that you use that work for you. We know there's lots of other things out there. So if you go to that website, which is also listed on the Data Management Resource Center website, which is navigable on the Unidata site, it's under data. Kind of, if you look at the top, of our website, you'll find data to the left. There's a real simple form. It's got like 6 questions. It's basically, you know, what is it? Where is it online? What can you do with it? Is it yours? Did you create it? Last thing. We're interested in presenting this information in multiple ways, as I mentioned. Right now, we have a table that has best practices and points to various tools. We also have the diagram you can select. But we know there are folks out there like myself, quite frankly, who understand narrative more. So we would like to identify some stories, right? If you're a researcher and you've used a certain stack of tools to manage some data, some variable for a field campaign, we would love for you to contact us, and we'll work with you to kind of capture what you've done and put it up there as a use case so that another researcher or student can look and say, well, I have similar data, it's looking at the same variable. I could do worse than to use this stack of software because someone else has used it and they were happy with it. That's part of why this is version 0.9, because we want to be able to basically present all these tools in a table compared to best practices, in a diagram that visually sorts, and then as a narrative based on uses, right? Like, how have other people done this? So please, submit tools using the form and send me a story if you've got one that you're willing to share. With that, I amazingly went really fast for a Southerner. I got us completely back on time. I'd be remiss if I didn't put up our funding slide and note that this is possible because of National Science Foundation funding. So I think I see a question from David.
I noticed one of the things you mentioned is quality assurance, and that's one of the things I do a lot of, and we built up multiple tools for that. And it's a big need in the community, I think, because a lot of time-based data needs to be quality assured before you do your analysis. And there's not a lot of software out there to do that. Is that something you're looking at, you're thinking about?
Yes. So there's a reason I went back to this slide. So this is the submit a tool slide. I will follow up with you, but I would ask you to also, you know, if you'll go to that site and make a entry for it, then other folks can start, you know, considering how to put that in there. That's absolutely true. We don't currently have a tool identified there, and another one that we currently have not mapped to is analysis, and the problem there is there's so many, right? So in some ways, referrals or recommendations kind of help us prioritize. So, any other questions? Okay. Then I think we can wrap up.